Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Ah, servile Italy, you hostel of sorrows, you ship without a helmsman in harsh seas. No queen of provinces, but of a brothel. Dante, Divine Comedy, Purgatorio, Canto 6. Picture Florence in the 1200s, not the postcard Florence of the Renaissance with Michelangelo, the Medici, and the Duomo. We're talking about a medieval Florence, a hard, ambitious, up-and-coming city of stone towers and armed families. Now imagine you're standing in one of those piazzas and everyone around you belongs to one of two camps, possibly parties you might call them. Half of them call themselves Guelphs, the other half call themselves Ghibellines. They don't just disagree, they exile each other and knock down each other's towers. They chase each other's families out of the city walls at sword point. I know most of you have heard of the Guelphs and Ghibellines and their conflict, but could you explain it to your not very interested in history friend before his eyes glaze over and walk away? Join the club. Most Italians in the Middle Ages couldn't either. So who are these people, and why did medieval Italy tear itself in half for over two words that half the fighters couldn't really even define? That's what we're going to walk through today. This conflict really comes down to the heart of what the history of the papacy is all about. If you've been with me through the Byzantine domination of the papacy and the end of an era series, or even our series on the history of the Catholic Church in the early United States, you know the two pillars that really hold up the whole thing. Everything comes down to them: the religious power of the popes and the secular power of the popes. Guelphs and Ghibellines is just the local, street-level family feud version of the same fight. And when you get down to brass tacks, this isn't just really a story about two political parties. It's more than just Democrats versus Republicans and funny hats eating really good food and having great art. It's the struggle that has been running for centuries by the time of the High Middle Ages. The struggle between papal authority on one side and imperial authority on the other. Who's actually in charge of Christendom? The successor of Peter or the successor of the Caesars? And that's a big deal. If you go back through the earlier episodes, you can see the whole run-up. Charlemagne got crowned emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day in the year 800, and right there you've got a tension or the push and pull baked right into the pie. Did the Pope make the emperor, or did the emperor just let the Pope hold the crown for a second? Then you get the Holy Roman Empire growing up out of that, a German emperor claiming to be the heir of the Roman Empire. Even at the same time, there was an actual heir to the Roman Empire in Constantinople. That is a different discussion for a different day, but you throw in the investiture controversy, the knockdown, drag-em-out fight over who got to appoint bishops, either the Pope or the secular leadership. That controversy ended in Canossa with Pope Gregory VII and Henry the Fourth, an emperor standing barefoot in the snow, and then that fight got patched over on paper at the Counts at Worms in 1122, but the underlying question never actually went away. It just went looking for new opportunities for controversy and conflict. In Italy, that opportunity for conflict came out between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Now, where did those two kind of strange names come from? The clue is in some good old-fashioned etymology. Words that began with the W sound in German, which would have had, at that time, started to be pronounced with the V that we're familiar with in Germany, became a hard G sound, a G, in Italian. We see that with names like Wilhelm in German, which became Guglielmo in Italian languages, or vera, or war in Germanic, to guerra in Italian. And it's something similar happened in all of the Romance languages, where that w sound turned into something with a g or a j sound, but we won't go too deep in the weeds in that. So keep that name or title, guerra, in the back burner, because it's going to come back in a bit, and not in the way you may think. So back to these Germans, back in the 1100s, the German lands had a long-running feud between two great houses over who would hold the crown. On one side, you had the House of Guelph, and on the other side, you had the House of Hohenstaufen, whose family estate went by the name of Waiblingen. Guelphs versus Waiblingens. Follow that sound shift rule we discussed, and Guelph turns into Guelfo, and Waiblingen turns into Ghibellino. The tradition says that the two war cries got shouted across a battlefield at Weinsberg around 1140, one side yelling Guelph and the other side yelling Waiblingen, and the name stuck to the whole conflict or dust-up. At the start, this German Civil War was really primarily focused in Germany. It was a dynastic squabble about the German throne, but then it got imported south over the Alps into Italy. Once the conflict crossed the Alps, it changed. It didn't stay a fight between which German family should be king all the way in Germany. In Italy, it got remapped onto that older, deeper question. Guelph came to mean roughly for the Pope, and Ghibelline came to mean roughly for the Emperor. Same names, but in a completely new argument. And that raises the obvious question, why would an Italian city give a fig about an emperor or the Pope? Why would Florence or Milan or Pisa pick up a couple of German nicknames and start dying over them? You know what I mean? The easy answer is ideology. Isn't that always the easy answer? Not completely, though. Cities did not, by and large, sit down and reason their way to a heartfelt position on the nature of imperial versus papal sovereignty. That wasn't how it worked. The city chose its side for reasons that were a lot more grounded and honestly a lot more human. Trade was a huge factor. If your city's whole livelihood depended on a certain trade route or on a certain market, and the emperor's policies helped your familia or your city, so your operation would lean imperial. Local rivalries were another. And this is a big one. Often a city's allegiance was basically decided by the city next door. If your rival across the river was Guelph, you were likely to become Ghibelline. Oftentimes, the larger city in an area was of one faction, and then the smaller city nearby that often was connected to that bigger city by trade and political dominance would be of the other faction, and that was really common in northern Italy. Noble families played into it too. The great clans lined up on opposite sides, and whichever clan you owed money to or hated or had married or not married into, that pulled you one way or the other. You tended to see the big cities and the small cities land differently, with smaller towns often taking that opposite label from their powerful neighbor, just who was trying to boss them around just to get some difference there, which meant alliances and allegiances often flipped and constantly flipped in many circumstances. A city could be solidly Ghibelline in one generation and then solidly Guelph in the next, because the family that ran the place lost a feud or a trade deal soured, or the rival town switched first. The labels could be permanent, the loyalties behind them were anything but. The Holy Roman Emperors were one of the big influences, because for a while the fight really did run through the men wearing that crown. The first one you have to meet is Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick Redbeard. The Holy Roman Empire is about as complicated and quote-unquote Byzantine as it gets, but I'm going to skip a ton here for this introductory episode. Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month, but it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/history of the papacy and join today.
Hey listeners, it's Kelly from Life Audio. We know life gets busy, and sometimes it's easy for your faith to get pushed to the side. That's why we created The Good Word, a free weekly newsletter designed to give you a moment to slow down, be encouraged, and reconnect with what matters most, God's Word. Inside, you'll find devotionals, guided prayers, podcast recommendations, and other faith-filled content we think you'll love. No ads, no clutter. Just good content to help you stay rooted in God's Word throughout your week. Sign up for The Good Word today at lifeaudio.com/The Good Word. That's lifeaudio.com/The Good Word.
So the short story is Barbarossa was a Hohenstaufen, so Ghibelline side of the family tree in this conflict, and he had a very clear idea about northern Italy. He thought it was his. These rich, proud, self-governing northern cities, the communes, the communes, had gotten used to running their own affairs, and Barbarossa came down from the Alps to remind them forcefully that they had an emperor. He campaigned in Italy again and again. He came down hard, and at one point he destroyed Milan almost completely. There are so many interesting politics and houses to talk about in northern Italy. I have an idea for a series of episodes on the great families of Italy and how they interacted with the papacy, and that's coming soonish. But getting back to it, Barbarossa's heavy hand did something he did not intend. It made the cities cooperate. These communes, who normally couldn't stand each other, who were exactly the rival next door types I was just describing, actually came together against him into what's called the Lombard League, and crucially, the Pope backed them. Pope Alexander III threw his weight behind the League, and now you've got the shape of the whole conflict in one snapshot. The emperor pushed down from the north, and the Italian cities pushed back, and the papacy was standing behind the cities, and it all came down to a head at the Battle of Legnano, or Legnano in American, in 1176. And the League won. The communes beat the emperor in the field. Barbarossa's attempt to simply own northern Italy failed, and a few years later, he had to formally recognize that these cities got to keep governing themselves. Why does that battle matter so much? Because it proved something. It proved the emperor could be told no. It proved the Italian cities, with the Pope in their corner, could stand up to the Germanic sort of heirs to the Caesars and make it stick. Now, an emperor losing a battle is one thing. The next Hohenstaufen is the one who really burns these identities into the bone, you might say, and that's Frederick II, Barbarossa's grandson. And I want to give this man a fair hearing because he's genuinely one of the most fascinating rulers of the entire Middle Ages. People at the time called him Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. And he was brilliant. He ruled out of Sicily, spoke all sorts of languages, kept a dazzling court, wrote a serious book on falconry, which I've always wanted to learn falconry. If anybody has any ideas on how to learn it, I'd love to hear it. But anyways, he also patronized scholars. If you just read the highlight reel, he sounds like a Renaissance prince born 200 years too early. He was also, from the papacy's point of view, an absolute nightmare. Frederick and the popes went to war over and over again. He got excommunicated more than once and by more than one pope to boot. That takes hard work, and Frederick Stupor Mundi was up to the challenge. Pope Gregory IX and later Pope Innocent IV threw everything they had at him. At a church council, the First Council of Lyon in 1245, for those keeping track at home, even declared him deposed from his actual kingdom. And every time the emperor and the pope collided, these northern cities got squeezed. They couldn't sit it out on the sidelines anymore. The emperor marched and the pope was threatening excommunication. Both pope and emperor wanted to know whose side these cities and families and even individuals were on, and they had to answer. Cities were forced to choose, and choose visibly. And that's the moment. That's when Guelphs and Ghibellines stopped being a loose German import and became deeply entrenched and inherited identities. It wasn't a mood or a vibe anymore. It was serious, and it mattered deeply. And once that was personal, the story stops being about emperors at all. It came down to the streets. So picture it now, not from the throne room, but from a normal Italian family in a normal Italian town. What did Guelph versus Ghibelline actually mean for them? It meant exile, lose a fight for control of your city, and you and your whole faction could be booted. It also meant confiscation of property. Don't forget revenge, as revenge usually works. Somebody has to avenge the revenge and avenge the avenged. It becomes a total mess. It meant family feuds outlived the people who started them. This is where we get the great tower skylines of some of the cities of northern Italy. In plain terms, ordinary civic violence was a normal feature of life. Your neighbor was your enemy, and everyone knew which side everyone was on. It was really gang warfare writ large and written on civic life. And this is where Dante strolls into the story, because this is what we would call today his lived experience. Dante was a Florentine, and by his day, the Guelphs had actually won in Florence. They had defeated the Ghibellines. So you'd think, good, whew, settled, wipe your hands of that mess, and let's move on. Nope. Once the common enemy was gone, the winning side did what winning sides often do. It split in half and turned on itself. The Florentine Guelphs cracked into white Guelphs and black Guelphs. The black Guelphs were a pro-papal party and really tight with Boniface VIII, who we'll get into in a later installment. The white Guelphs wanted larger political autonomy from everyone, pope and emperor alike. Dante was a white Guelph, and when the black Guelphs seized control of Florence with papal and French help, Dante was exiled, and he never came home. He wrote the Divine Comedy in exile and died in Ravenna, still locked out of the city he loved, Florence. And it comes across in his writing very clearly to this day. He just wanted to be home. Dante wrote beautiful prose, possibly the greatest in Western and maybe world history. His writing was chock full of metaphor and playing with themes, but this was his life story as well. So how does a conflict this fierce, this personal, this generational end? The honest answer is it just faded out. That's simple. No great battle or Death Star moment. The whole conflict lost steam and didn't really matter anymore. Frederick II died in 1250, and the Hohenstaufen power started to unravel. His heirs got picked off. His son Manfred was killed in battle, and then his young grandson Conradin was captured and publicly executed in Naples in 1268. And with that, the great imperial house was essentially finished. You'd think that would be the ending. With the emperor's line gone, the Ghibelline cause would just have ended too. It doesn't. The name of the conflict survived the thing that they were all about. Cities kept calling themselves Guelph and Ghibelline for generations after there was any real emperor versus pope contest left to fight over. The labels detached from their own meaning and just kept going. Like a habit nobody remembered the reason for. The politics underneath shifted. The independent city-states rose and did their own thing. The great powers rearranged. The Black Death came through and wrecked everything, along with the Avignon Papacy. By the time of the Renaissance, Italy's energy went in a whole new direction. The old question, Pope or Emperor, which one truly ruled Christendom, slowly and quietly didn't matter like it used to, and not in the same way. The label stuck and people fought as Guelphs and Ghibellines long after nobody could quite say what the fight had originally been for. Once you strip away the German family names that had been Latinized or Italianized, and the towers and the family rivalries and the clans, what you're left with is the same two pillars we come back to time and time again: papal power and secular or governmental power, religious authority and secular authority. They're always grinding against each other, century after century, just wearing different costumes each time. In the investiture controversy under Barbarossa and Frederick II in the streets of Florence, it was the same fight over the same issues. What I was really trying to get at in the end of an era series, and the major theme of the Middle Ages started in the 800s with the crowning of Charlemagne, and then all the way down to the final end of the Papal States and the Vatican I Council was this push and pull between papal and religious power and secular and governmental power. Now, I did say Dante got exiled, and I left him standing there in exile on purpose, because we're headed over to his story in a way. In the next episode, we're going to look at this Guelph-Ghibelline contest when it was burning hot. We're going to look at a Guelph leader Dante actually places in the Inferno. What is odd is Dante and the society at the time really respected and admired this leader, but Dante placed him in one of the lowest levels of the Inferno. In a conflict like that, nothing is simple, and seeming contradictions start to make sense or make us ask more questions. With that, we'll leave it here with another piece in the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.